can you explain to me what are tariffs and how do they impact everyday life?
Sure. So one of the biggest misconceptions about tariffs is that tariffs are taxes on imports. And so a lot of times we don't understand fully who pays those tariffs. So what happens is if I go to like Sweden and I want to import Swedish chocolate into the United States to sell at IKEA, when that chocolate hits the border, I might have to pay a tax on that chocolate because it's an import. So who pays that tax? It would be me as the American business who's purchasing these goods abroad to sell here in our country. The foreign governments don't pay tariffs. The foreign companies don't pay tariffs. Rather that it's the American importer. So then that tax is going to get placed onto the consumer. And that consumer is you and me. So if we buy bananas from Honduras or chocolate from Sweden or t-shirts from China, those are essentially sales taxes on the goods that we consume every day. And those taxes can be either shifted to me as the American consumer, or perhaps the foreign producer might say, goodness, I have competition from other countries. I might give a discount and eat some of that tax. So it's all what we call as economics, a price elasticity or sensitivity to that price. So I'll give you one example. 90% of the vanilla extract that we consume in the United States comes from Madagascar. So if I was Madagascar, I'd look around and be like, I don't have any competition. There's no way I'm going to pay this tax, so I'm going to shift that onto the American consumer. So by and large, we find as economists that American consumers end up paying this tax. The tariff that's being proposed is a universal 10% tariff on every good imported into the United States. That means there's no more cost advantages for countries to try to give you a discount. So they're just going to shift that entire 10% onto American consumers.
That's interesting. And so you're talking about this shift. When are we going to really start seeing those possible price increases? When are we going to like really see it and really start feeling that impact?
Sure. It all depends on the type of good that you're talking about. As economists, we think about durable and non-durable goods. So a durable good is like my Subaru or the refrigerator at my house. I'm only going to buy one of those hopefully once every few years. But for example, bananas are a non-durable good. So when the store starts running out of their inventory of bananas, they're going to have to order more from Honduras, and then I will have to pay that 10% tax on those bananas as a consumer. So some folks might say, well, that's easy, just buy American, right? That's how you avoid the tax. But unfortunately, supply curves slope upwards, meaning that the only way that I can get domestic producers to make more goods, to fill the holes that would have came from foreigners, is to raise the price. And so essentially the domestic price is going to match the foreign price plus the tariff. So you're going to pay this 10% no matter which goods you buy.
So kind of what I'm hearing is it's just going to raise the prices of things. So are there any benefits to these tariffs being put in place that you can explain?
So sometimes we might have benefits to tariffs, but only on very specific things. Before I came to UT, I taught at West Point, and I taught national security economics. So for example, when you hear about a sanction, like when Russia invades Ukraine, essentially a sanction is a mega tariff that we say, hey, Russia, we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to say that anyone that imports oil from Russia has to pay an infinite tariff, meaning we're just going to block oil imports. And that's hopefully what we're going to do is wreck the Russian economy to make Putin do something that we want him to do. That might be a reason for tariffs, but there's still no cost avoidance. Gas prices still skyrocketed when we instituted those sanctions. So leadership would then be saying, you as Americans, we're going to pay more for some kind of geopolitical win on the global stage. Right now, we're not finding that advocacy. We might think that China, for example, isn't following trade rules, so we might use some tariffs as sanctions to encourage them for better behavior. That would make sense, but then we would need to have clear and strategic signals for those policies to work. Not tariff the penguins in an island off the coast of Argentina, because that's not a clear signal that China can truly think that we are serious about our public policy.
Wow. And so how can students then, or just community members in general, start preparing for that price increase?
Yeah, so I think one of the best things that we can always do, because whether it's public policy or a pandemic or a recession, is we just always want to be prepared. So it's always smart for us to avoid unnecessary consumer debt, hold cash reserves in our bank accounts, be ready for a kind of a rainy day. The one sad part about tariffs is they're also reciprocal tariffs. So if I say we don't want Swedish goods anymore, Sweden might say, well, we don't want American goods anymore. And that could cause the aggregate demand for American goods to drop. And that might mean layoffs here in the United States. So it's always smart, whether it's sunny outside or rainy outside, to have a great savings account with a cash reserve in case something affects you dramatically.
Mm-hmm. And so here's another question for you. Why are they put in place? So what is, like, when they're saying we're going to put a tariff in place, why are they saying that? And then are they then effective in that reasoning as to why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there might be a couple reasons why. We talked about the national security reasons. There might be like an industry that we feel like is important for us to have. So most of our microchips that go into all our electronics come from Taiwan. And if China was to cross the South China Sea and try to seize Taiwan, we might be in a world of hurt. Mm-hmm. But if we're not really competitive in that industry, so thus we might want to block some foreign competition to get some domestic microchip producers a chance. And that was the CHIPS Act by the Biden administration. Still, that's going to mean higher prices for those chips. And it's going to take huge amounts of revenue from the government to get these infant industries going. Some people also say, well, we're going to make revenue off of tariffs. But I like to point out that the most effective tariff would set the foreign price equal to the domestic price, and there would be no cost advantage for you to buy cheap Chinese t-shirts. So then you would just buy American at a higher price, and there'd be no revenue generated. This is what we discovered as well in the last half of the 19th century that the administration likes to point to. The answer was we imposed huge tariffs then, and we generated some revenue, but then what happened was the economy went into a deep depression in the 1890s, and that caused huge financial panics. We tried this again in the 1930s to try to get out of the Great Depression, and it made the Depression worse. So it seems like about every 100 years we forget those lessons and we have to try this hard medicine once again. So,
mm-hmm. Wow. Let me see here. So where in the economy specifically are we really going to see these tariffs like truly hitting home? Because I mean, yesterday we saw a lot of it going up and down and yes and no. So it's kind of confusing, right? And so can you explain to me like where are we like definitely going to see this and kind of that
so let's assume that we were going to live in a world where we're going to wake up one day and we'll have one set of rules and tomorrow they'll change, because that's been about the pattern. Where we're going to see the economy get hurt is when what we call long-term investment. So for example, if I make plastics like folding chairs, I might want to have a new plant in Mexico to go with my plant in Tennessee. But if I'm uncertain because the second I make something in Mexico and bring it across the border, I get paid a tariff. I'm not going to build a gigantic plant and increase my production until there's some kind of certainty. And so anything that's going to build new production lines, anything that's going to hire more workers, that's going to be a large factories kind of being built, those manufacturers are going to put that all on pause because it's here today, gone tomorrow. I mean, tariffs are bad public policy, most likely. But what's even worse is uncertainty. Because all of a sudden, none of the folks in the business world know what rules are going to be, and it's impossible to plan and make long-run profitability estimates.
Mm-hmm. So just kind of give me your personal opinion. Why do you think that they're being used so commonly right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is not the norm from the last 70 years. I think that we have seen the American economy over the last few decades shift, and it's really hard to know why. Because there are three big trends that happened. First is that we saw a lot of free trade agreements, or lowering of tariffs with countries like China, Japan, Germany, South Korea. We also saw a lot of immigration within the last couple decades. And then we also saw new technologies of automation. And so many times we have seen our manufacturing base shift from, I could get a job with a high school diploma and go work at General Motors and assemble cars. And that's not going to happen anymore. So it's very easy when you have an angry workforce, particularly in the upper Midwest, to say, oh, this is trade with China, or this is immigration. It's all globalism. And the actual answer is it's not. It's automation. Because if I was to bring these factories back from China or Mexico, for example, American wages are so high now that I would just have robots assemble cars. I wouldn't have workers do that. And so the best way for us to be able to make our workers still competitive is that they're probably going to need to do additional education from high school. We need to re-empower and reinvest in community colleges, in vocational training. Because not everyone's going to get a college degree, but if they would get one of these certificates, then they could go do high-tech manufacturing that the United States actually is really good at. And they would get higher wages than they would have ever done assembling screws on a Ford truck from the 1970s. So we've seen the world change. But that's part of life. The world always changes. It will never stay the same. But protectivism or nativism blocking these forces is a fool's errand and will result in a dysfunctional economy. It's best to lean into the things we're good at and invest in the human capital that pays off in the long run.
Wow. Okay, one last question for you. Can you explain to me talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old,
Sure.
and tell me, what is a tariff? Explain to me like I'm 5 years old.
Yep.
Tell me exactly what a tariff is.
Yep. A tariff is an extra tax that's put on any good that comes from the outside the United States.
All right. Is there anything else you might like to add that you think we might find a little bit more interesting to kind of help this kind of confusion, honestly?
Yeah, no. I think what always is important here is that the world is a complex place and it requires complex solutions. And when we look for our leaders and our policymakers, anyone that tells us that we can easily solve these giant societal forces with one lever or another, or on day one, or if it's magic, is probably selling you something. What we want to do is we want to think about who are the serious people that are going to understand the trade-offs at play and design the best public policy for us so that, one, we have the best kind of government that we can run, but two, that will unleash market forces that will bring the most long-run true prosperity to our country.